I am very happy to welcome all of you to the first public program of our department for this academic year. Before we begin, a quick reminder that the chat function has been disabled, but Robin will respond to questions at the end of her lecture. Feel free to submit questions into the queue at any time by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window. We also have live captioning available for this event, which can be enabled by clicking the closed caption button at the bottom of your screen. I want to also invite you to join us for some upcoming GSD public programs. Tomorrow, September 14th at 6:30 p.m., please join us for a public lecture by designer and architectural historian Vittorio Lampugnani, who will demonstrate how designers can learn from the layered historical and contemporary knowledges embedded in cities. And then on Wednesday, September 21st at 6:30 p.m., Anne Anling Cheng will give a lecture exploring how racialized gender, specifically the specter of the yellow woman, animates the designs of futurity. Please visit our website for more information on these and other events. It is my pleasure to introduce Robin Winogrond, design critic in landscape architecture at the Graduate School of Design. An American-born Swiss landscape architect and urban designer, she developed her award-winning practice over the past 2 decades, primarily in the Swiss and German contexts. More recently, she was the founding partner of Studio Vulcan in 2014, with whom she practiced until last year when she re-established her own firm, Robin Winogrond. Robin has had a sustained interest in how design can intervene in the landscapes of the urban periphery, those that are the product of typically extensive infrastructural interventions, such as roads, drainage, transportation, and communications, that generate marginal, leftover green spaces that have no identity and that no one claims as their own. In these prosaic landscapes that could be anywhere in the world, she discovers the poetic potential that has been subsumed under the hyper-rationalization of modern infrastructure. What is compelling about her work is that she accepts the great contradictions and paradoxes embedded in these places. On the one hand, she sees in them the unstoppable forces of economic growth and territorial expansion, and on the other, the source of possibility for the construction of meaningful experiences. Robin imbues these landscapes with an atmosphere of specificity, an ambiance that strives towards a sense of place. This is what she calls her search for geographical re-enchantment. To describe the intellectual lineage of her work, it is perhaps easier to start by saying what it is not. For instance, although her work is grounded in site specificity, the work goes beyond the singularity of land art to create immersion at multiple scales that bring together layers of ideas. And although she's interested in the idea of place, she is not interested in recovering or restoring a previous or original condition. Her work is resolutely not nostalgic. The concept of genius loci informs her thinking, but her projects do not necessarily blend with their sites. To the contrary, they are distinct interventions that point to a new temporality. She's also not interested in the theorization of the terrain vague, the junk space, or non-places. Rather, her thought process recalls some of the early work of Georges Decombe, for instance, and I am thinking here of his tunnel footbridge at Lancy, in how they both disturb the over-rationalization of engineered landscapes to bring back to life these muted grounds. And one can also recall in her work Sébastien Marot's search for meaning in the landscapes of suburbia. She's most influenced by Maurice Merleau-Ponty's work on the phenomenology of perception and by contemporary geographer Alistair Bonnet, who advocates for a renewed focus on place, describing the placelessness in which we conduct so much of our lives as, quote, neither intellectually nor emotionally satisfying. Simply said, Robin is a builder of place on sites that have lost their identity. Her search is for that which elicits the imagination and engages the multi-sensory nature of human perception. Robin has received many awards for her work. Recent ones include the Landezine International Landscape 2019 Award for Best Office, the Landezine International Landscape Award in the Public Project category for Zurich Airport Park in 2021, the Hochparterre Prize for the Museum of Natural History Park in St. Gallen, Switzerland, and first prize for the National Expo Switzerland 2027. Her work has been published in Topos, in Topiaria Helvetica, which is the journal of the Swiss Society of Garden Arts, in Landscape Architecture Europe, Anthos, Paisea, and Landezine, to name a few. And she's a frequent guest at the ETH Zurich, at EPFL, and in the international symposia such as TU Berlin's Can 21st Century Landscape Architecture Form the World, the European Forum of Urban Forestry, and the 16th Venice Biennale, among many others. Please join me in welcoming Robin Winogrond for her lecture In Search of Geographical Enchantment, Making Place on the Urban Periphery. Robin.
Good. Okay, thank you. Excuse me, everybody, in these times of COVID, we have to be flexible. So it's an absolute pleasure to be here today. And Anita explained fairly well what I'm trying to do, but I have to keep putting the word re-enchantment, the word re in front of the enchantment, because it's not only about enchantment, not in any way. And this lecture puts a specific optic on the projects I've done. It's a body of work or a way of thinking that's evolved over the last years, probably 10 years. And it's what I've been teaching here at the GSD in the last couple of years. So I'll take, well, I think I can do the slides myself. Is this correct? Matt? So I would like to qualify the title a bit more. Anita did a very nice job. What do I mean by this and what I see as its meaning and relevance to what we're working on? And I'll begin that by talking about the context in which I do most of my work, which is Switzerland. And it's both a Swiss and global phenomena, the standardization, the continual standardization, and in that sense, the banalization of our built environment from the unique and the specific to something very generic and without a specific identity, which is quite a worrisome way to live in the world. This was the topic of a series by the renowned German photographer Thomas Struth, who took a photo series outside of Zurich and wordlessly explains this phenomena. What do we call landscape? This is a typical Swiss landscape. It's empty of any kind of soul and expression. It fascinates in that way, but as someone focusing on building places, one has to ask, how do we achieve a place that offers more than this? Switzerland is also a mountainous country. It has limited land on which to build, but it doesn't have a tradition of being urban. So it builds very low density and very spread out. So as you can imagine, over the last 30, 40 years, the country has been filled with what we call the agglo, a bit disrespectfully, the agglomeration, meaning the urban fringe. And so this makes up a huge part of the majority of the places in which I work. And one says, what can you do in these places? And what can we expect from these places? When I was fairly young, I ran into this quote by Le Corbusier, the purpose of architecture is to move us. And it touched me very deeply. I come from a family of architecture lovers. I grew up with my grandparents in the Mies van der Rohe 900 Lakeshore Drive in Chicago and going to all the Frank Lloyd Wright. And that really touched me. And then I thought, well, that sounds good. Architects can control spatial definition. They can control spatial sequence. They can control the fall of light into the space. And so it's much easier to achieve this very difficult task, of course. But when you get into doing landscape architecture and urban design with no specific control over these factors, where we're looking at parking lots and where we're looking at traffic arteries and all these other things, how does one achieve a place that may have the ability to go under our skin? I followed the discussions of atmosphere, or the architectural discussions on atmosphere, for quite a long time. The most noted authors of an entire series of books and lectures is Johanni Palasma, Peter Zumthor, Stephen Hall. And in one of the books that came out a few years ago, I was reading the foreword by the editor, who apparently is an academic. And the editor put this beautiful picture of Paris in the 1920s from the photographer Atget, and sepia colored, mind you, not in real colors, and put in a plea for us planners to please put more atmosphere in our projects. And I thought, thanks for the tip, but obviously you don't have an office, because my project sites do not look like this. They look like that. So where does it go from here? How do we move forward on looking into these issues? And I began to look at the sites that I work on myself in a more specific way, and try to understand the voice of nature and the voice of landscape in our contemporary urban landscape, and the power of water to always be archaic, despite this concrete canal, and the vegetation that will take any chance to shoot up through the light between the raised highway and the raised train tracks and the footbridge, the what's it called, pedestrian bridge there. And actually, I love this photo. It's just taken from my iPhone, but I absolutely find a kind of a magic in many of these sites. And I've taken it on as a challenge to try to understand how to use them. This is a photo also taken from my iPhone on one of the projects, which I'll show in a few minutes. And it's exactly that kind of clash, that those contradictions, those paradoxes of our contemporary landscape that fascinate and have the ability to engage us, and to engage open questions without answers, as opposed to landscapes where we say, now I've got it all down. It's all pre-read. We know just what you're going to experience, and it's all kind of canned for you. And I think my projects tend to raise many more questions than the answer. This is the airport park in Zurich. And this is an artificially planted woodland and wetland juxtaposed with a parking garage and advertising behind it. So on my search over atmosphere and different issues to move towards something that I could find might come close to the Le Corbusier quote, I ran across this book in 2015. And there are two expressions in that book that seem to capture this, what I'm trying to get at in words, which is very hard to do. I had never been able to articulate it like that. And those two expressions are the geography of imagination and geographical re-enchantment. And the meaning of them to me was geography in the sense of a concrete place, and then the aspect of imagination, or the aspect of re-enchantment. And it's beautifully written by Alistair Bonnet, who I actually invited to listen today, because I've been propagating his book for so many years now. He's a professor of social geography in England, Newcastle. And so I became very fascinated by his ability to articulate the environment that we're forming more and more of. And I'll just read this quote from him. Unruly places have the power to disrupt our expectations, of stimulating and reshaping our geographical imagination to re-enchant geography. Aristotle said place should take precedence of all other things. It orders the world. Space sounds modern in a way that place doesn't. The reaction of modern societies has been to straighten and rationalize the oddity of place. Oh, so sorry. This is a painting by Gerhard Richter, the German painter, who magnificently captures the sense of standing in geographical space, in concrete space, and having our imaginations move into his paintings. And I also became more and more interested in this dialogue. The only way to get at this stuff is to become interested in the dialogue between the inner and outer self, because we're actually talking about a marriage between what happens outside of our bodies and what happens in our bodies. So there's two more small quotes here, and I'll be going on to the projects quite soon, but I want to wrap up this understanding of what is my search for geographical enchantment, and why I think this search is a necessary search for more than just myself. Borges said, the taste of the apple lies not in the fruit itself, but rather in the contact of the fruit with the palate. In a similar way, the meaning of poetry lies in the meeting of the poem and the reader. And another person who's able to sum this up just beautifully is Andrea Wolf, who wrote the book recently about Humboldt, The Invention of Nature. For a scientist like Humboldt, who was trying to understand nature, the dualism between the external and the internal world was the most important question. Humans were like citizens of two worlds, occupying both. So I decided while working on this expo project, in fact, which I will also show today, that I needed for myself a scheme talking about landscape. I guess one would call it a scheme or something. Sorry, my English is not quite up to par anymore. Many people have imagined or made a system for understanding landscape over the years, most notably John Dixon Hunt, who has the natural, the cultural, and the garden level, the designed layers of landscape. And I decided that I couldn't continue working without an imaginative layer, so I, so to speak, made up my own landscape theory for myself to use. I use the natural as the underlying carpet. We all do, because it's there. It's the power of raw nature, wilderness, the archaic value of all these natural materials, which I'm quite interested in. Above that, the cultural layer, the urban, political, social, and cultural landscape, planned and built by society, rational production, and so on. And above that, I place a third landscape, which I call the imaginative or the personal sphere. It's the intellectual, the emotional landscape. It's informed by memory, experience, longing, and that we actually have to conceive of landscape as being a marriage between these two things. So to wrap up this introduction to the title, In Search of Geographical, Re-enchantment is not about nostalgia, prettiness, or being emotional. It is the search, using projects as concrete testing grounds, to suss out the poetic potential of a site with the ability to fascinate, engage, defy expectations. It aspires to create memorable and specific places which serve as catalysts of our imagination. That being said, I would just like to mention the projects that I will now show are, some of them are from my office before the founding of Studio Volcan. My office I called Robin Winogrond Landscape Architects. Some of them are from that period. Some have been constructed in the space of Studio Volcan. And some of them have been done within the framework of Studio Volcan, where I was greatly responsible for the design. So what I'll be showing today is a lot about who I am and how I design as a designer. I'll begin with the Museum of Natural History in St. Gallen, which Anita mentioned. This is the site before the design was made. It's a fairly small plot on a slight slope, spanned between a new Museum of Natural History, just behind us as the viewer, and looking to the backside of a beautiful cathedral. And it is a former cow pasture. But more remarkably than that, it has the irony. Okay, you see the Museum of Natural History on the right and the church on the left. And that's the site. And ironically, just on a park that should talk about the history of nature, natural history, it's on the roof of a highway tunnel and surrounded by sports fields, multi-family housing, a traffic artery. So it's completely embedded in this sort of strange agglomeration experience. And the challenge to me was, how do I immerse people in an experience about the history of nature in such a setting? And I used several tricks, I would say, because we're all designers here. I will speak about them. I wish I could use a beamer, but I suppose that's not the way it works these days. The first thing I did was to plant two forests. I would call them forests, mini forests, sort of forest groves on the edges, in order to capture the person's attention in a defined space. And this, one of the second things I did was, I was thinking about stepping stones in gardens, and how when we walk in gardens, we take these sort of gingerly steps. Stepping stones bring us into what Merleau-Ponty calls participative perception. And I raised them to the size of 2 to 7 meters. What is that, 20 feet, maybe? Let's say 10 to 20 feet in dimension, and began to use them as a kind of exhibition, path as exhibition. And the nature of the garden or the park is that it has strewn clues to nature that arouse your curiosity and become catalysts of the imagination. This is, just to say quickly, this is just after planting, so it's looking quite barren at the moment. It's now the 3rd season. And these are the giant stepping stones, which become this sort of space of discourse with nature. I'll go through a few of the measures that I took. You see here an artifact from an architectural artifact and a pile of rubble. The main stone of that area is a stone called, well, sorry, it's not the main stone. This is a green sandstone that's used for all the cultural monuments of Eastern Switzerland. And I took it both in its man-made cultural form and its natural raw form. And the entire park is strewn with the natural raw rubble. And this forces the viewer, on one side, it lets you walk anywhere you want. So you're tripping across these clues of nature, not following a path that's teaching you, but you're You can drift through the park. And it also gives a direct visual confrontation between the two forms of this stone. I used the concrete pavers for an entire series of messages. The nagelfluh is the most common natural stone in the area. And it's basically identical to concrete in makeup. So when you hammer it, it looks identical to nagelfluh, and it is, in fact. And so to make this point again about the natural cultural dialogue, I also pressed drain mats, wooden slats, did all kind of things to the concrete so that it was a constant confrontation between the raw and the cultural version of it. They're fossils. This used to be a tropical ocean in that area. Fossils, giant dinosaur bones and eyes and legs and all kind of things. Dinosaur head, there's an eyeball, a giant eyeball somewhere too. Here's a quote, there are a series of quotes. The letters are about 12 inches high from the Bible, from researchers, and this is from Darwin. Nothing in life is constant except change. Scientific expressions, metamorphosis, supercontinent, they're all taken from the literature of the museum. This is the second year where the woodland is just beginning to fill in, and it's going to become much more expressive over the time. So it sort of gets a kind of a wilderness, an urban wilderness. And to have this enormous span of history, something that we can comprehend, I broke it down into three main geological eras. And these are giant stones that have rolled down. I'd like to go into anecdotes, but I think I'll keep the time short. Anyway, there's a story to tell about every single thing that's in this park. And these are giant erratics that have rolled down from other cantons, which is something that really happens. The forest underway. The hydrangea were a real controversial thing. We were dragged through the mud in the press because they're non-natives there. They're from the other side of the Alps. And I said, we need to express this artificial site. We have to put in something like that. And the very fundamental ecologists were absolutely out of their minds. And now, of course, we need to take plants from below the south side of the Alps because of climate warming. Just a few last images. This next project is the Circle Park. It was completed last winter. It's very new. I give sometimes subtitles to my projects. This one, Natural Preservation Meets Shopping Mall. It's done together with Studio Volcan. It was an international competition we were able to win. And you're looking here at the airport, and you see, I'll use my hand. That is the park there. And the question was, I'll tell a little bit about the history of the site and what it's supposed to do. You can see it's isolated, encircled by a highway. There's a model of the competition site, the park, and what you see on the left side is an enormous 8-story building by the Japanese architect Riken Yamamoto. Just to get an impression of the place, to the left, the airport. This is the new Circle building just opening now, and that's our park right up here under construction. And when you look out from this park, you're always falling off the hill, staring at this mega structure, in fact. So it does dominate in the atmosphere. You're looking through the woods and staring at this. This is the picture you saw with all these strange contradictions. So the narratives that I wove into this project, I actually got from comparing these historical maps during the competition. It's an archaic glacier moraine. It became the front door, let's say, park to the airport in the 50s. And in the 60s was bitten into this glacier moraine by a giant parking lot. In the 70s, they completed a highway to reach the airport. And to compensate for the lost land, they plopped the topography on top of the hill, planted artificial wetlands, fields, and woods, and set it under natural protection. So you have a kind of a wedding cake layering of an archaic glacier moraine, then the artificial excavation, then the artificially planted natural landscapes, and then the airport under natural preservation. And the task of the park or the competition was to make a park for about 10,000 users a day. So you have this very intense uses. It's something like an urban park. It's actually an aglo park, as we would say, but in fact, it's all of it. And we weren't allowed to lessen the biodiversity that was there. We weren't allowed to put another meter of path than what was there. We had very, very tight constraints. So I'm going to quickly go through the atmosphere of the park and then how we built it. I became fascinated in the pictures that I had taken on site, this is before the competition, and how they extremely resembled historic Swiss painting. So the site in a way is almost like a historic painting. And on the other side, you can't get much more banal than this. You can just sometimes die there. It's so dry and so ugly. So it has those both faces to it. And what we did in the office was we took the ecological structure, you see it here on the left, as the basic bones of our project, and started to work from there into making it into a park. And here's the plan, the competition plan actually of the park. So I did two, I could say, narrative tools to make the park work. And one was to make a huge 200-meter diameter circle of beech trees, which announced the moraine. They address the circle building, that's the name of the building there, and they become an icon for those flying over from all over the world. It's understandable by any user. And the second narrative is the vertical layering that I just mentioned, where you have below the archaic Swiss moraine, then the planted artificial forest, maintained, planted and maintained by foresters, this strange sculptural topography, which no one could do better because it's all by chance, and then the sky as the upper layer. Here are a few images from the competition. This is going up a funicular that we were asked to do. We had to have a way to get handicapped people to the top of this hill. So this was them going up through the moraine, which is still there. Then the woodland layer, we worked with a specialist from Sweden, actually Danish specialist for woodland laboratory. Maybe some people even know him. And he was teaching us how to take these very young, this is how it looks today, the very young forest maintained by foresters with no diversity in visual experience or any kind, and how to work with that woods to form it. This is a visualization for the woodland layer, how to insert these small interventions because we weren't allowed to put any foundations in the woods. Also in the woodland layer, in the vertical layering, a pavilion that I designed, which walks up the hill to interact with the strange topography and frames views going up into the sky and into the woodlands. And now all the way at the top, the sky platform, which at the time of the competition, I just couldn't decide if it should be a reflective film or fog, steam coming up, because my goal was to make the sky itself into a palpable space that we say, I'm standing in a space called the sky, and it's not just something above us. So here it is constructed. This is a drone photo. We have two main paths that structure the park. This is the sky loop and the woodland loop. And then the small interventions that are in it. A picture from looking up towards the sky platform. The tree ring, these are 12-meter high trees, 12 times 3, 36, about 35 foot high beech trees. They are not red leaf, they're, the natural, non-genetically manipulated, so they keep changing colors. This is a new category. We spent about 1.5 years with ecological and woodland experts negotiating how to work with this and make it into a park. We weren't allowed to say the word for the first 2 years because they were so threatened as the natural preservation people. We made a new category called open woods, and we opened up some of the woods to let in the light. Here's some of the sketches choreographing the woods. And just I put this in once more to show you these. These are the old maintenance lines to maintain the forest where the machines would go through, and they're so charming that I decided to use one as an alley with hazelnuts so that kids could run through them. I kept 3 of them so that they'd be this strange space that you can't understand. We had huge discussions like the foresters who said, we don't plant anything more than 3 feet high. And we said, but this is a park. And they, well, we don't, that's what foresters do. We only plant these little things. And no, we need big vegetation. So sometimes we won, sometimes they won. Here's a sketch of the pavilion afterwards, and this idea that the pavilion would walk up the hill and interact with the hill. And this would form a kind of a stage situation where there could be music, readings, yoga teachers, whatever, and all the ways people could use this space. Here it is under construction. And I'll now go into the construction photos of the site. So here we are at the Woodland Pavilion. These are a new take on the Adirondack chair, which I brought over there. No one knew what the Adirondacks was. And we have fabulous furniture designers who translated this into a new chair. It's just lovely. This is something I call the fire ring, a magnet within the woods where people who don't know each other all come to grill, which is kind of a national sport in Switzerland. A meeting place, then something I made up, the yoga mats and the yoga mat principle, which is that the yoga mats would address this incredibly steep artificial topography and they'd sort of rest on the edge, which of course was a little bit tricky for safety. But here you see the yoga mats, they're sort of very large beds where you can sleep and do yoga and read and kiss and whatever you like to do. And they're looking up at the only high trees on the site because those are capped level where at the airport trees are allowed to be. This is the surroundings that the park looks at when they're not looking at the building. And now we come to the sky platform. We just went up from through the vertical layers and now we're at the sky. And we found a wonderful technique where it was possible to do both reflective and the fog. And now you see it in the moment of transformation from reflective to fog. This is a 30-meter, what was that, 90 feet platform at the very top of the hill. You see we're in the crowns of the trees. The fog comes. And the idea of this terrazzo, this polished stone, is that down at the bottom, it's very raw, which is about the glacier moraine, and it becomes more and more polished as we go up until it becomes this very abstract platform reflecting the sky. This is an iPhone photo for me. When you go in there and there's no wind, you literally get lost. And that's not easy to get lost in urban conditions these days. And here the atmosphere on a foggy day, completely different atmosphere than the other images. And the funicular taking people up to, not to the top. Frank Lloyd Wright taught me this very young, never to the top. The next project is called Wildwood Plaza. It's also from my former office before Studio Volcan. We built the last of 3 plazas we built together with Studio Volcan. And this was a lovely project. The head of building from a smaller city near Zurich called me up one day in my old office and said, could you do something for us in the woods? And I said, well, what do you mean something? And he said, well, like anything, something people can have an experience, a woodland experience. I thought, gee, that's fun. I mean, that's the most open brief I've ever gotten to do a project. So I went to this city, this small city, and I took a walk around the entire city. And I'm afraid the sketch is lovely. It doesn't help you too much. I'm just going to tell you, this whole white space is the town itself. And this is a lake, one of the glacier moraine lakes that are in Switzerland. And what you see here is a drumlin landscape, a woodland landscape, and then the lake landscape. And I came back and said, look, you have 3 main landscape typologies in your town. And I would like to do something to address this larger territorial landscape. He said, the neighbors right here in this little piece want to have a new path. Could you just start right up there, please? So I did, in fact, start with this little woods. And this is this little woods called Verhützli. Now you can see an aerial. And what I discovered is that the woodland here, and on these 3 sides, it's a small hill, are completely different, completely contrasting imagery of woods. And I was thinking how everyone likes to say, I'm going in the woods. I'm going to take a walk in the woods, as if it's a thing itself. And I thought it would be quite interesting to have people being in these special spaces and recognizing the differences, just having time to spend and stare at the woods and experience them. And here's the path connecting for the neighbors between the 3 spaces. And these are very, very close to each other. And talking about this suburban landscape, I mean, some of them you're literally looking in the bathroom window of the neighbors. These are the 3 different landscapes. To the left, the huge, stately, mature beech trees on the side of the hill that was protected from enormous storms that blew through Europe. In the middle, the pioneer beech tree where storms razed the entire woods. So it was completely empty and they're shooting up and coming back like a jungle. And on the third side of the hill, this completely strange landscape where shallow-rooted trees were tossed around like giant brooms and made this kind of apocalyptic scene. John Fowles is a British writer. He wrote a book called The Tree, and I love this quote where he describes the experience of being in the woods so beautifully. Nowhere but in the woods are the 2 great contemporary modes of reproducing reality, the word and the camera, more at a loss. The woods defeat viewfinder, drawing paper, canvas. They cannot be framed, and words are as futile, hopelessly too laborious, and used to capture reality. So I thought, okay, how can I make an immersive experience for all these suburbanites who just have a little quick moment to immerse themselves in the woods? How can I make this really as strong as possible? And the paving, then I chose to take the same material as the woods themselves. So that instead of saying, hi, I'm a plaza and I have a paving and here are my benches and all that kind of stuff we do, I would just stay completely pure and let the voice of this forest be as loud as possible. So here's the paving and the seating. This is the first circle with the stately beech trees. And the idea of the circle has to do with a kind of a cyclorama, because the main quality of forest is that you have no front and no back and no right and no left. You have no sense of orientation. And it's this drifting sense that makes them so powerful to us. And I was fascinated by that sense of how the woods are. And so the circle allows you to just move and not say, okay, here's the front and here's the focal point and all these other things. This is the second circle, clearing. And the third. Next project is the sister project for Wildwood Plaza. The city won a prize for the last one, and they called me up several years later and said, could you get us another prize? And I said, well, you know, what do you mean? Oh, just make another something. So I went back several years later, and I went back to my original plan with the lake and the drumlin and the woodland landscape. And I said, okay, let's go to the lake this time and do something there. And this site happens to be right at the lake landscape I was chatting with. It's a beautiful panorama of the Alps, amazing panorama. And just behind us where we're sitting are sort of typical Swiss grill stations and benches and all these things. And it's a big field for swimming. And in my core, I'm fundamentally American. And I always found it so sad that the privacy is a very, very important value in Switzerland, this private sphere. Everyone's kind of always with their friends and their cliques, and you're not really interested in chatting with anyone else. And I always found that sort of the whole spirit of grilling and all these things kind of sad. And I decided I'd like to make in this typical recreation landscape something that would become a sort of a magnet. This, you know, people love to come to this lake and have this great view and so on. And so I decided to make a cowboy cowboy campfire, I'd say. That's 10 meters, so it's at 30 feet wide. And I decided to use the same material again, the tree stem, and create a kind of a magnet in this space. And what that does, it's sort of a jumbo XL piece of furniture, you could say. And it creates, on one side, a marking of this field. It creates a social magnet. And by moving the stems back and forth and using these stems another way, you create an entire series of social niches where all different groups can come, but they're participating in a community whole, which is quite rare to do there. And here it is being used. I was passing by and chatting with some of the teenagers who are hanging out there, and they said, this is our favorite place to come. Every night we're here. And I said, why is that? And they said, because you can be with your friends, but you feel you're all together. It's a sense of community. As Americans, we find it the most normal thing in the world, but for Switzerland, it's kind of a revolutionary thing. But to make this beautiful social space surrounding this archaic bonfire, they actually have wood. The city puts wood there all the time, and that's just quite a small fire, but you can make a giant bonfire, and we're like moths attracted to this fire. So here people, you can lie on it, take a nap, kids play on it, they jump around. There are all different uses for the site. Showing the character, drawing out the character of the wood itself. This is what the people working on the wood said. I said, oh, that's super, super beautiful. It means, and he wrote down, super beautiful. I saw that at the foresters when I was collecting the wood. When they cut wood really fast, you get these beautiful markings, and I thought it brought out the character of the wood so beautifully. It's a very soft material and temperature neutral for the body. And in the evening, when it becomes cool, you can move down to these stones and have this heated seating. Next project I'm showing is the first competition we won. We did it just before Studio Volcano was even created, and won it the first week we opened the office. It was a two-phase competition, kind of for artists and architects. We partook, and this is a traffic artery leading out of the western edge of Zurich. The funniest site I've ever had. It's 50 centimeters wide and a kilometer long, so like 2 feet wide and half a mile long. And it's, you see the street there. And the National Highway Authority said the frame for this sound barrier wall will be concrete, and the competition is for filling it with something. There's a new law in Switzerland saying that wherever a strong traffic artery coming from the highway entrance goes through a residential area, they're required now to put up a sound barrier wall. So the city of Zurich said, we'd like to do something more than just put up the normal ones. And they did this competition. And you can see again, I mean, more banal than this street, you can't really get, except in other projects we do. So I had done my master's thesis many years ago on water and light, and how they're two materials that never have their own visual identity. They take their visual identity from the materials around them. And glass has the same property, which is why I'd worked a lot with glass. And I proposed that we take this etched glass and fill the wall. It's 4.5 meters high, and not so fast, but let's say 15 feet. And we fill it with different amounts of glass that's etched in different amounts. And it would abstract this curious surroundings. And there's a very nice verb in German that says it. I'm just going to jump down to the lower part of this quote from John Cage. If you listen to Beethoven, it's always the same, but if you listen to traffic, it's always different. And I read that quote while I was working on this project, and I thought, isn't that fabulous to have these moment-to-moment happenings within the city, people moving, office lights going on, off, sunset, etc., being displayed in this giant screen. I call it a screen of happenings. And here I am working at the urban scale, working with the glass. That's a hill, landscape hill, autumn leaves, an office building, working with the light, a change of light in the evening. This was actually a test for the competition period, but we're much further now in the process. So you capture the natural and artificial characteristics of this site, and through the blurriness, transform them into something else. Next project was another 2-phase invited international competition we were able to win, and it's under construction now. Quite often it's in Heidelberg in Germany. And it's a remarkably profound project. I call it a traumatized landscape in the neighborhood. It's a former Nazi military base, which was then taken over by the Americans and occupied until fairly recently. So it was always a forbidden city, a walled city, and it was the NATO headquarters for all of Europe. And the competition was to take all these fragmented open spaces around, they have a parade grounds and a riding grounds and like all these different leftover spaces, and Nazi military, the commissaires could go in this beautiful park and so on, and take all those leftover spaces and turn them into a kind of a contemporary reading or a contemporary park. Here we're looking at the parade grounds. It's about 300 feet in diameter, huge space, looking back at the main building. And it's somewhere between fascinating, cool, and triste. What is that? Sad. Here's another picture. At the time of the competition, a lot of the vegetation wasn't healthy and it's unfortunately been removed, but this sort of overgrown, lost space and a telecommunication tower site. And we said, let's call it the Park of Encounters, and use 3 different kinds of social encounter, historical encounter, and contextual encounter. So there are all these different ways in which a place that used to be a forbidden city becomes a place of contemporary encounters of all different kinds. And the main one is this historical encounters in the center, which I'll show right here. And from the 27 teams, we're actually the only one who even worked with the history. We were given a book of relics that are left there from the Nazi time, the American military, whatever. And I was absolutely mesmerized by this, especially being an American and Jewish person, feeling somehow identified with this. I have absolutely nothing to do with German history or the Nazi history, but I felt compelled to do a rereading of the site. And so without going into too much detail, I'll just say, there's the oak tree, which is a historic symbol of power. The Nazis confiscated it as their own symbol. And I said, we're giving it back to the German, sorry, sometimes my English words don't come, German folk, I don't know, people, by making it the main tree of the site. There's the eagle, the same, an archaic symbol of power. The Nazis confiscated it as their own. I'm giving it back to the German people. I'll tell you how in a moment. So there are all these different elements, the walls, et cetera, that have been reconnotated, basically a rereading of the site and of the history. And as an American Jewish person, I may be one of the only people who could use humor to work on this site. Of course, the Germans are still fairly traumatized, and they were making pink playgrounds and all these different kind of things, striped ground. I go, what do you do with this place? And so I was able to maybe capture a certain moment of this history in a rather humorous way. This is the only huge oak still there as a witness before the Nazi time, a witness to the landscape. There's the Nazi eagle, Reichsadler, surveillance cameras everywhere. Oops, so sorry, I don't know what happened. Old furniture everywhere from the US time. Funky 1970s lamps, ugly, funny, weird, all this stuff kind of hanging around. Here you see the site and all these strange fragmented places that we had to do something with. And there's two things we did. This red band, actually an idea from my partner, which is very clever, which makes it into a coherent place, binding it all together. And I'll show you how we translated that. And within that framing, these very particular identities, and then I rename them. So the parade grounds, which is the show of power control, becomes the forum, a place for discussion. The riding facilities where the horses were ridden, also a show of power, becomes the cultural plaza. Like everything became something else. And I'll go into a little bit of detail about one of the spaces. This is the forum, that big space you saw. It's shrunk for the visualization. It's still huge. And how do you make it into a place for discourse? The Reitplatz park, where we leave everything and just put these little intarsian in where people can appropriate it. Using cartoons to explain the social encounters, the social possibilities. This is a lounge next to student housing, and you see all these weird 1970s, 1950s lamps kind of all collected there to be a almost museum. I called it memory lane, putting all these artifacts in different places. And this is the only thing I'll go into detail on. This is the entrance plaza to the entire area, the entire barracks. And I propose that we collect all the surveillance cameras and fill the cameras with birds' nests. So the birds would be singing and happily making fun of the Nazi eagles about power and control. And we weren't quite able to do it in that form because the cameras didn't allow it, but this is the plaza that's being constructed right now, and we're doing, turned it into a sound installation. These are all different cameras and lighting masts, and they'll now become a sound installation that tells stories for all the different users that have gone through, the civilians, the military, the children of different cultures, et cetera, and there'll be sound bites telling that. This is the red band grinding up all of these fantastically ugly and sometimes beautiful pavings and pouring them into a new concrete. And this is the red band that follows the entire thing with the shredded pavings of the history. These intarsian in the, is that German intarsian? I don't know. Little installations in the park using the historic materials. And this, these are the control cabins where everyone had to go through and be controlled if they were allowed to enter. And these radius of transportation gets spun out and become this enormous play area with these different play worlds within them. And the last, a layer on top in which this is some furniture I saw in Rio de Janeiro and in San Francisco. This is kind of cool. I guess they're from the 70s. Sort of seating pods, and it's a new layer we call confetti that's with colored rubber, and that's a new layer of social encounter that follows the red band and brings the park together into a cohesive whole. This is a competition from 2020 in Hamburg, the city of Hamburg, Germany, and also two-phase international, all kind of things. We unfortunately got the second place. I was also completely taken by this site and the topic, and it hasn't let me go yet. But it's basically, I will show you the site, actually a phenomenal place. Hamburg is an international port, very, very important port, and it's about kilometers, miles. It's about 100 miles east of the sea, and it has this enormous network of waterways that comes in. You're looking here at historic Hamburg, right here. And those are all the kind of garden neighborhoods that go out. And you can see water is everywhere. And the site is this one just here across from Hafen City, for any of you who know it, from Miralles, and very close to the center. This is the landscape, how it looked before when the first sailboats coming in. There's historic Hamburg, and you see this delta landscape of interweaving of islands, water and land, and moving into an industrial period where water became an incredibly lively, important aspect to the face of the city. And this is just taken from Google Maps. What you have in that landscape is the ocean brings twice a day, high tide, low tide, brings in phenomenal amounts of silt and silt in English. And silt is a fine grained material that they haven't been able to come up with to do anything with it, but it comes in every day with this huge amounts and you don't know what to do with it. So the city not only has a problem of what to do with all this silt, they have all the big ships coming in, so they have to dig deeper and deeper and get rid of the silt somehow. And the water in the meantime is going up and down 4 meters, there's a 12 feet twice a day. And the city keeps building higher and higher to avoid getting flooded and to figure out how to get the big ships in there. So nature and the city are in a complete clinch with each other. Here once again is the site. And the competition was to do an urban scheme and landscape scheme for the entire site. This was our scheme, having the buildings with small streets, again, to encourage a kind of a social encountering, a social liveliness in a new neighborhood, as opposed to just putting in high rises, and then using the edges of this to make a tidal park. And I proposed this tidal park because I couldn't let go of the history. The more I worked with a colleague who's an expert in that, the more I became completely drawn in by this tidal story and how to use it to make a park that expresses it. And I called it the Urban Delta Lab, and proposed that it would be an international center for discussing how deltas work within cities all over the world. Here's a picture from the site, just a few images to sense what it's about. Looking back towards the city. The site itself, the old storage halls, where they go with boats and cut it. And all these walls are falling down and it's sort of romantic and overgrown, and that's all going to disappear. So the question is, this is also on the site, you'll see in a moment, this is a roof where the ships would come here and park and then get rid of their goods. And it's like crazy structures, incredibly large structures. So here you can get a sense of the project, the Delta Park in the middle, the Urban Delta Laboratory, the living services, and then these open spaces. And I decided to make this Delta Park with studying the site into 4 zones, because the water coming up here has a much higher relation to the tide and has a dynamic, a movement where the ships are going. So this part I called the, I'm going to have to translate freely, the moving delta, like streaming delta, the channelized delta. This is between the big walls. This is the old place where the ships would actually turn around, like around them and go out. This is the shifting delta, and this is the stranded delta. So the tempo of the water becomes slower and slower and becomes more and more natural. So I typified the delta into 4 kinds of delta and called it the Urban Delta Laboratory Grassbrook. And this is just an image, the sense of how water moves and begins to shift these landforms while they're going. So here's the 4 delta categories that's slowing down, 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 and making other kinds of landscapes for birds and so on. This is a scheme of the entire tidal park, the Delta Lab, with 11 places that each in their own specific way address the identity and the qualities of this tidal park, and then reference images. And one just here is a place where lots of birds have landed because there's a whole series of posts in there. And I called it the Duckfoot Park. And these landscapes of which we just saw, it's a certain construction and shape that looks a lot like a duck foot. And so I took it over and made it into sort of a bird sanctuary. You can see the pieces of it there. That's the big roof you saw. That's looking towards the city, high density. Again, the roof, Duckfoot Park. This was done together with adept architects from Copenhagen. And designing the park and trying to use the language, find the specific language of these shifting lands of this Delta Park. And of course, we also did the open space scheme for the entire urban area. The next project is also an international competition to face, which we were able to win in Lugano, that's in the Italian-speaking part of Switzerland. A waterfront promenade in Italian Lungolago. So Lungolago. And the name of the community is Paradiso, which is quite sweet. it's a very strange community. Here you're looking at the Alps, you're looking at Lugano, and Paradiso, the community, begins just here. And unfortunately, it's a very charming old 1950s resort place. The lake is spectacular, the views are spectacular, but the current mayor is quite bent on getting kind of, let's say, more Saudi Arabian, Dubai type tourism, glass high rises and these kind of things. So there's a real conflict of identity at that place. But the biggest problem, the reason for the competition was this town is situated quite high above the water. And I'll show you some images. Oh, this is just an image, has nothing to do with the project. It is the project site. We're standing on the project site. But just to say, there's some places you work in and you think, pinch me, can this be real? And this is one of them. It's just gorgeous every time. We're looking across over to Lugano. Now you're looking at the community of Paradiso. It's very thin because it's mountainous. This is something like the mountain in Rio. And the project site is this strip of their Giardino Pubblico, their public garden. And then all of these sites to, sorry, I'm gonna say it wrong, to here, which are all privately owned. And a big highway goes through and the town is quite high above the water. So the task of the competition was to connect town and water. Here you see it again, Lugano and Lugano Paradiso. This is an image showing that kind of relation where high topography comes right out of the water, and the trees often form a sort of a silhouette looking out to the lakes and the mountains. And this is the site, and this is exactly the effect we have. In winter, the site is completely in shade, and you're looking out at the sunny side, but the trees take on this fabulous sort of silhouette. So I tried to use some of these principles, which I found there on site in the new design. This is a local palm called one calls it the Ticine palm. It's not the real name of it, but it's recently categorized as a neophyte. So we're all of a sudden weren't allowed to take it. And this sort of just very, very difficult process just while we were in construction, basically. I'll quickly go through the competition. There's something I was very interested in. I'll show a slide in a moment about using prepositions when I design. And that comes from Christian Norberg-Schultz, which I'll show in a moment. But this is showing the way we structured. We have this a passeggiato, actually passeggiato al monte at the mountain and the passeggiato at the water. And we use these platforms to connect these two passeggiati. There are two different levels. And this one on the water, offering an entire series of experiences of movement, moving over the water. And so I'm just going to try and find my, here it is, the Christian Norberg-Schultz. Christian Norberg-Schultz wrote the book Genius Loci. I think I've been saying German, Loci. And in somewhere in there in the introduction, he mentions that prepositions are the word we use to describe our experience of space, above, below, in between, aside, alongside. And I've really found it to be true, and I use it quite often in my projects. So this is the final design. It's probably post-competition even. And this is the Passeggiata Lago, this great, enormous passeggiata going past all these private sites. The only way people have access to the water is by Switzerland now moving these boardwalks into the lake themselves, because there's no other chance. And this one I called the arena. It's the Giardino Pubblico, making this great arc and all these different spaces. And this is exactly what I was just talking about. So I choreographed the whole thing saying you're at the water, on the water, towards the water, in the water, etc. And the whole thing was based on these experiences of water, and each site had its own particular character. And this again, in Italian, of course, you have to speak lots of languages over there, vicino all'acqua. And this is one of these podests, we call them. It's just, there's a construction photo site, and I'll show a few pictures. What happened is the mayor was so choleric and dominating that it was impossible to do the project with him. So we actually walked away from the project. We're just doing very small things. It was very, very painful to do, but it was an impossible situation. He degraded everybody in the project daily. But you can see this is a real photo. It looks like a painted photo. The Alps and these, unfortunately, canary palms, which we had to change at the very end of the project. And here's some of the sites. This is the arena, sort of the kickoff of the Passeggiato, and here's the park. There you see a little bit of the park. And I won't even go into the details of the design. So I'm almost through. I have a short project. Well, actually just a couple of short projects left. This is a temporary sound installation that is coming down this week. It's been up for 3 months in Basel, city of Basel. And the city has IBA, again, just like the Heidelberg, it's the International Building Exposition. It's money from the federal government of Germany. And they asked different cities to do innovative urbanism or architecture or newly a bit of landscape. And this one is in the Basel is where Germany, France, and Germany, France, and Switzerland meet. And they made one of these projects for last year, a big festival called the International Building Exposition, to activate train stations other than the main train station. So we were asked to do something, again, like do something. And I ended up doing this project. And here's is a very important architectural building from a Swiss architect. This is the Badische Bahnhof, it's called. This is near Baden, Germany. Gorgeous building. Here's the main hall, also gorgeous hall. And we were only allowed, the building is Swiss, but when you walk in, you're in German territory. It's the German train company. And they're very worried about escape routes and surveillance cameras and hydrants and advertising, all these things. So we were just allowed to put something in the corners. There was no other space we were allowed to use. And we were really interested in these sculptures outside, this is, big sculptures on the facade and the fountains and so on. And we sort of carried that forward into the space. And I started making up sculptures. I have never worked figuratively in my life. And I started making up these, well, I started studying the people in the train station and realized they have all these personalities. There's the one kind of waiting for somebody, and then there's the voyeur, and there's the one greeting, and there are all these different characters in the train station. So I started making these 3-meter high, what would that be, like 10 feet high angels, train station angels, each with a different character personality. And then taking the idea from Heidelberg of putting the sound installation in, having them tell stories, tales of travel, anecdotes, all kind of things. And here I am working up on a ladder with my little figurines, working on creating these sculptures. That's where the speakers come in. They're made of, this is at the point of styrofoam with concrete, putting in the speakers for the sound installation. First sculpture done. And then they stand around in this magnificent train station. This happened to be the exhibition at one of the museums. And I thought there's a certain similarity between ARP and the train station angel. And they all sort of tongue-in-cheek got these names, these bronze plaques. So the angel of, these characters are the angel of dreaming, the angel of observation, the angel of greeting, the angel of joy, the angel of speed, and the angel of solitude. And these are 6 personalities that you find in the train station. Here's someone listening. That's the angel of joy greeting you. Angel of solitude in the background. Angel of greeting in the background. And people listening to these different stories that are being told in 10 different languages. The relationship of materials to the site, the angel of speed, and the angel of observation and dreaming, and the underway. So you move, they take you in a sequence moving through the train station from the Great Hall to the underpass of the tracks. And I'll finish now with the expo. This was one of the also most remarkable projects I'll ever do in my life. I suppose it was done together with the architect Cecilia Schaefer and the writer Plinio Bachmann. It was a 2-phase international competition with 80 entries. And Switzerland, every 25 years for the last 100 years has had, or 80 years, has had a national exposition which ties together this very fragmented country of different languages and different cultures. And they each have a theme, the Expo of Defense, the Expo of Industry and Innovation, etc. And this competition was opened up in 2015. And the name of it was the Expo of Living Environment, the Living Environment, something like that. And we were able to win this, and it would have been absolutely remarkable, but the far right politicians managed to go on a propaganda campaign, not against our project, but against having any expo, against wasting money on these kind of things. So unfortunately, this will not happen. But I'd like to show you, to finish off, the proposal and why I think it's a significant contribution, and to wrap it back to the title, the geography of re-enchant, in search of geographical re-enchantment, because it is a lot about this. Landscape is a very, very important discourse in Switzerland. It's in the newspapers every day. Land is a limited resource, and everyone's fighting to use it, from the farmers to the, whoever, traffic planners, recreation, everyone's trying to use these square meters of land. And this is the site we were given. It's 3 cantons, 3 states. It's the entire northeastern part of Switzerland, you see up there. And the other team, 79 or something, looked for a site to do their expo in, or maybe a couple of sites. And we said, well, we'll just take the whole territory, thanks. We're going to actually turn the discussion, a territorial discussion, into a discussion about landscape as a resource, how it's used and how it's been used for hundreds of years. All the things we can take out of landscape, we can glean out of landscape itself. Here's just a picture. There are all different kinds of suburban agro situations. There's one bigger city, St. Gallen. It's probably 100,000 people. I don't even know if it's that big. But also up in the mountains, there's still some of the pagan rituals happening. This is at Sylvester New Year's, where, these are some of the costumes they wear in New Year's in this particular village and mountain situation. And the writer, who was just fabulous, he was saying, well, we don't want to do anything kitschy like that. We don't want to do that kind of stuff in history. And I looked at these pictures, which I hadn't known. I said, they're wearing landscapes on their head. This is amazing. They're wearing hats that portray all these different landscape scenes. I found it absolutely phenomenal. I was singing praises, and we did end up using it as a basic conceptual building block also. This thing, because they have the ugly and the beautiful. Some people wear the scary part of nature. They wear trees and branches, and they're the ugly. So it's called the ugly. And these are the beautiful. So it's this discussion of ugly, beautiful, schönwüste. I can't even say it in dialect. So anyway, that's just to say it has all these different aspects here collected, and no one ever has the overview. And one of my basic premises for a long time is that landscape doesn't have its own voice. It doesn't have a singular voice. We don't give it a voice, and it has no lobby. So what we did is we did all these readings of the landscape and tried to make it into the discourse of the expo. That's the mountain landscape, the urban landscape, and the lake landscape connecting to Austria and Germany. And here it is in section, the mountain landscape, urban landscape, and lake landscape. And use this technique of collages to express a kind of a juxtaposition of a magical or surrealistic reading, a complex reading of these different landscapes. And we used a main question for each one. In the mountains, the historic, archaic, where do we come from? In the urban landscape, who are we? This is Union Station juxtaposed with the Cathedral of St. Gallen. And the lake landscape, where are we going? In the sense of longing, future, international connections. And then we did I won't even go into detail, but it's here you see the landscape hats. For each of these bands, we did an entire series of characteristics, attributes, a resource, a current planning problem, etc. And the idea was to have participation at this huge level. So traffic planners, investors, politicians, artists, landscape architects, whoever, would all come together, and in existing structures, from underground bunkers to ships to grain towers, wherever, would be having discussion also with the lay people and discussing landscape as an actual point of departure and point of discourse. This is in the middle of the aglo, the central point, like in a weird service area, the lake, the different zones. And each visitor got their own individualized treasure map based on their own interest in readings of the landscape, which they took with them along on the trip. And we got 300 train cars that had been taken out of service and turned them into rolling landscape and a rolling discourse. And with that, I'd like to end this plea for a geographical re-enchantment of that we consider our built environment. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Robin. That was absolutely wonderful. And I am so glad that you are here and you've been teaching our students, and I hope that they absorb everything that you have to say about the way you work and the projects that you've made. So as you can see, just those of you that are worried about COVID, we're in the same room, but we're about 20 feet apart. So that's why we are not wearing masks, even though they are mandated inside Harvard University buildings. So we are very safe here. So there are 2 questions right now in the Q&A. I hope the students get very brave and ask questions. I know they've been at school for only a very few weeks, but we'll give them some time. I certainly have several questions for you. I'll begin with the first one from the audience. Are there particular philosophical, spiritual, or religious traditions that inform your thinking and work?
If I had to name one, well, maybe I'll name 2. To have an explicit answer, when I was very young, I ran into phenomenology, which is a German branch of philosophy, basically the philosophy of perception. And it really took a hold on me, and I never stopped going back to it as a point of reference, because it's a very rich thing. They actually say it couldn't have come into existence in any language other than German, because German is the only language that could manage to get down the phenomena of how we perceive. So it's a very tricky thing, and it's very slippery and hard to get your hooks into, but when you do, it's very revealing. Or it has been to me, that example of Christian Norberg Schultz and the way he described how we experience space. And I've used that on quite a few projects. These prepositions, they live within me. When I design, I think about how the body is constantly in relation to where it is in space. And I find that very, very fascinating. And the second is not a very direct answer, but I would say being a sort of a inherent anthropological voyeur, just being in love with reading our surroundings and reading place and reading people and behavior and social encounterings and weather and natural phenomena and all of these things. When you soak it up, not necessarily in a rational way, but in a intuitive way, I think that's one of the best schools of knowledge I've ever found for myself.
Thanks for that beautiful answer. So I'm going to maybe bring up an issue that I was going to ask, which is very much, in conversations. How important is it to experience a place that you're going to be working with? And I say this, it is let me give you some background. Last year with Zoom instruction, we saw that the students were able to design without traveling and going to sites. And the work was pretty good. So, and yet, you obviously demonstrate a very, very deep level of engagement. And how much is this cultural, language driven? So by now you're also German, very fluent in German. You mentioned Humboldt. Of course, Humboldt said you had to come to America. You couldn't be writing about it from Europe, never having seen it. Goodness gracious, you couldn't even map it. You couldn't even perceive it, understand its culture. So how much is this part of your own sort of background, design formation, or is it medium specific to landscape and nature, etc.?
It's a great question, and I'm it depends on which words I choose. I'm sure there are many approaches to landscape. I'm sure there are many approaches to any profession, and we know there are many approaches to any profession. I did learn quite a lot from my former office partner, and my former husband, who almost never went to a site. And he was a brilliant reader of aerial photos and of maps. But his intention was to read and structure the place, almost kind of a storytelling for the place. And I was astounded how much through the distance, how much you could glean or reread that you couldn't do when you were too involved in it. So that was a very, very important lesson for me. And I try to go between the two. But he, for example, rarely goes to the site or to the building site because just not, everyone has their own interests. But I would say I almost, to the great pains of collaborators, I've gotten better, but I'm almost like a sculptor, no matter how big the scale is. So I actually walk, and I'm not alone. Georges Decombe, I was really happy that you mentioned him. He's someone who says he works a lot on site. I absolutely have to work on site because most of my information comes from watching that light move, from hearing the sounds, from sensing all the things one senses by being in the space. So I work extremely through the embodied experience and generate my narratives out of that. Someone else can generate their narrative somewhere else. And they both can be very relevant and meaningful. But I personally, if I have to do a summa summarum, as we say in Switzerland, if I have to add that all up, I don't believe you can build places without intimately knowing the place. So the projects we loved, I mean, I thought I was going to die last year when I had to teach, not going to the site. That for me was inconceivable. But what we learned is the students, because they're clever, they're talented, they're interested, motivated, we gave films and plans, they all could do something good. But it doesn't mean that if you really had to build it, that it would have been appropriate. It doesn't mean that it really would have sat, and it doesn't mean it would have engaged the people. It doesn't mean it would have caught the spirit of place, but we don't know that because it's all online. So if in the end, I'm very, very clear that the best projects come from a very intimate spending of time. And I'm the one who sat on the airport park like a lot. I sat up there, I spent my time there. And that's where a lot of this generated my work. A bit long answer, but.
Second question, for the beautiful bonfire wood circle, how do you control the quality of the woods that would come to be used? And how is the wood treated to be weatherproof and sustained through years of weathering?
Yeah. I assume that's a landscape architect asking, or maybe you all are. Robinia Tsurioacacia is in English.
Locust.
Locust, thank you.
Black locust.
That's a very, very hard wood. It's used for playgrounds all the time. And I especially I took it also for Wildwood Plaza for both of those projects. So it actually is self-weathering, self-protecting, pardon. It's self-protecting, and it stays for about 10 to 15 years. So that's quite long for wood that's just out there with no treatment at all. And I'd be hard pressed to take other woods that wouldn't do that. Although weathering, one could have the topic of weathering and say it kind of falls apart, but it's harder to use things that fall apart. What I did do, because I couldn't resist, was I left the bark on, and the bark falls away. And this will take about 5 years. So there is a weathering process that will happen in that whole project. But hopefully that the basic core of the tree trunk should be quite hardy for a while.
Next question. Your presentation showcased various sources of inspirations, quotes, site conditions, history, for how you have hinged conceptually given a particular site or prompt. What is your process of assessing the strength of a concept that you have considered?
Gosh, I'm not quite sure if I understand it. How do I assess if a concept sits and fits?
Or if you have several for one site, how do you end up using one versus the other?
Okay, excellent question. Absolutely excellent question. It is one of the most important things we do, is move ahead, is glean out something I made up last year while teaching, and I started using this year again, telling the students to brainstorm in a huge, open, non-judgmental way, and then distill the essence out of that. And then when you get down to that essence, that distillation, you brainstorm within that distillation and you open it up all over the place. And then you take the best of that, you distill again. So you're always moving closer and closer to a core that absolutely rings true to the site. And I do measure it probably intuitively, but I measure it in the sense of meaning and in the sense of relevance to say, am I expressing something that really is worth expressing? Because we can all tell narratives. I'm telling a story and my grandmother had red shoes and I don't know what, and that doesn't help us. So the idea of sensing, how do I get closer and closer to that voice of that place? And how could this engage the user? And we're talking about huge numbers of users, of course, and a very wide array of users for our projects. Everyone from the client to the maintenance people, to the ecologists, to the kids playing, to whoever it is, the ice skaters. And we have to incorporate all of them into what we do. And I still try to make the strongest voice that's there, not all these functions, but the place itself. So within that distillation, I try to say, this has the potential to go under our skin. And this doesn't. That's probably where I end up.
related to that, I found it a common pedagogical practice to seek to remove sentimentality from our work, considering the importance of nostalgia in private and by proxy public memory. Why do you seek to remove such associations from your work?
Also a good question. I actually don't. I don't at all. All of those words are relevant to what I do. It's just the problem is when you, I try to avoid the misunderstanding. Some very, very good, interesting journalist wrote about this option studio I did a couple of years ago, which I titled In Search of Geographical Re-enchantment, and interviewed, I think we spoke for 1.5 hours, we looked at the student projects, and in the end, the article kind of missed the point that I was trying to make and made it sound like I'm making a course about making lovely, romantic, longing and all these things. What happens is the opposite effect. When you take out the content of why it's relevant to make places that have power, that become a strong identity, that confront us and also challenge us to think about our built environment or to live our built environment, and just go into that emotional language, it does lose. You can't get anywhere with that language. I mean, you can make a beautiful place, you can make a sappy place, and I'm a super romantic and I love enchanted forest and I love all that. But if we start the discussion there, we're not probably going to get anywhere that has a broader relevance. So I actually try to flip it just to make the point. I don't call it In Search of Geographical Enchantment, but re-enchantment and re-finding, or whatever that word is, that what's meaningful in that site, reinventing it almost. And I think the idea of just making enchanted places probably comes up too short and will not fulfill the broader expectations we have professionally.
Thank you, that's a great answer. Related to this, when reclaiming such stark Nazi symbols, and I would say any other symbol in you use text, you use so many different kinds of symbols in your work. Were you afraid of misinterpretation? Has your creativity ever been stifled by fear or worry? If so, what were your steps in meeting that challenge?
Beautiful questions you're all asking. In Germany, I made a very, the project I didn't mention today, but I mean, I have worked closely with ecologists, done a lot of participation work. I mean, there's whole universes out there that I didn't even speak about today. It's just to focus on this one thing. But Germany was in a very intense participation process, and we used it in our competition entry as well. So there's a lot happening there. And although I lived in Germany for quite some years, I would never wager to interpret their history. So I did it in a very gingerly way and with the sort of humor. And I used the feedback, the resonance from the people themselves to say, we can say that, we can't say that, or whatever. So of course I use anyone who knows more about something or has a relation stronger than myself as a double check. And in the other sense, in terms of fear driven, that's a very good question. And I don't have an answer offhand. I think maybe I could be a bit more fear driven sometimes than I am. I tend to think you jump in and you do, with a very strong empathy, you look for the meaningful fields of discourse, and you listen very well with very strong antennas to those around you, to the clients, to the people there, whatever. And usually the mix comes out pretty well. I mean, you don't go tromping in and declaring things or whatever, but in this mix between I'm reading your place and I'm going to glean out of it what I can and then present it to you in a coherent story, I have to say, almost always have an audience with big ears and eyes who are very, very thankful for this kind of way of making an identity out of where they live.
Okay, and then one last question, since we are out of time. Do you think naming place names and their associations affect a site's sense of enchantment? Are the stories that have accrued about a place part of the re-enchantment? From an American perspective, I wonder about the loss of ancient place names or ignoring them, and what the effect is on how people interact or respond to landscapes here. landscapes that are often seen as a tabula rasa rather than a place where layers of human habitation accrue.
I think it's absolutely true. I wouldn't rename places just to rename them. If you're working on a place of historical significance and the name is part of that identity, and I just heard that Columbus Day is now Native American, Indigenous Peoples Day. And I had to let that go through my mind for about a week before I could sort of grasp what that's about. You know, it is about replacing a narrative with a narrative that we find is more socially just today. In the case of Heidelberg, in the case of the Campbell Barracks, because I worked so intensely with the site and its history, because I left the 100-meter diameter emptiness of the parade grounds, which, I mean, you know, 300 feet, you know, how big is that? Because I explicitly left all the historic relics, and the entire concept was based on showcasing these strange mix of historic relics, to rename them not something about power and control, like the parade grounds, which is where uniformed people paraded around to show their power, to rename it the Forum, which is inherently talks about discourse, is actually, it's a working name, and they may call it that, they may not call it that, I think they might, but it's about re-narrating or recoding this military place, but explicitly because I left them the way they were, more or less, or we changed certain things. I think that double meaning, I think the multi-coding becomes very interesting. And it's always specific. There are no rules. I don't know if I'd have to think really hard, what rules could I say they're always the case when we design, except be attentive. That's about it.
So great way to end your comments. Thank you again, Robin. This was a very special talk.
Wonderful. Thank you, everybody, for listening.